Hello and welcome to another edition of the GNAT TV News Project In Depth. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT TV, and it's my pleasure to be with you today and discussing school choice, a question that has once again surfaced as an issue in educational circles. With me today to discuss this subject is Oliver Olsen, who is a state representative from Winhall, Jamaica, Stratton, Londonderry, and Weston, and also Seth Bongartz, who is the chairman of the Board of Trustees at Burton. Gentlemen, this question seems to have resurfaced again following a meeting of the State Board of Education last July when a few rules were proposed that would change the way that the State Board interacted with independent schools. And Oliver, I know you got concerned about that. You sent a letter to the chairman of the State Board of Education, Stephen Morse, outlining some concerns about those proposed changes. I wonder if you could summarize those for us and get us started here around what's going on and what had you concerned enough to write that letter.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Andrew. In a nutshell, what the state rules propose to do, they propose to do a number of things, but the most egregious thing that they are proposing to do is to require independent schools to assume all responsibilities of a public school, all of the trappings of a public school. And it explicitly states in the rules that independent schools would have to comply with all state, federal rules and laws that apply to public schools. That might seem okay on the surface. The problem is that our independent schools are structured completely different versus public schools, and they have been for over 150 years or so that we've had them here in Vermont. So there are many practical implications, and I'm sure Seth can go through many of those, but a few examples are certified teachers. Our independent schools, many of them do not have faculty that are fully certified because those certifications are really applicable to the public school system. Rules around financial reporting, et cetera. I actually have a summary, it's a 2-page summary of many differences between independent and public schools. So it's a massive change in policy. And the schools that are unable or unwilling to comply with those requirements would no longer be eligible to receive tuition dollars from our local school districts. So the impact to our community is, in a word, devastating.
Seth, how would these rule changes affect Burton?
Well, Burton is an independent school, so Burton is one of the schools in the crosshairs, if you will. And we have a 180-year relationship with our towns. We've built a climate and culture with our towns over the course of those 180 years in a climate of trust and interaction that this would absolutely blow up. We would no longer, they're really saying Burton can no longer be an independent school. Burton can't be the school that's educated kids in the way that we have for the last 180 years. And that we would, for instance, the board would have to dissolve, and there would have to be an elected board. That would undermine entirely the ability to conduct fundraising the way that Burton has, and the trust in the climate and culture that's led to our ability to raise the kind of money that Burton's been able to raise and provide the kind of education we've been able to provide without without having to charge taxpayers for that. It's really quite remarkable what we've been able to accomplish under the system that we operate now. We also, as Oliver mentioned, we have teachers who are not certified teachers. They're fabulous teachers. We've got administrators that are not certified administrators. We've been able to bring in people from the community from time to time to help teach classes where they have. My father taught drafting at Burton for years. He's not a certified teacher. He wasn't a certified teacher, and yet he provided something that nobody else could have provided at the time. That's actually a minor example. The bigger problem is that we've got a system now that does not rely on all certified teachers and certified administrators. And if you look beyond Burton, so by the way, Burton is an independent school. That's not going to change. So really what the State Board of Education is doing is saying that if these rules go forward as they are currently being promulgated, they are saying most of the kids who not come to Burton can no longer come to Burton. That's what's at stake here.
And that's what also would be at stake at other schools like Long Trail or Maple Street, Mountain School, at Winhall and Stratton Mountain School.
All over Vermont.
Those would all apply. Well, let me just play devil's advocate then for a second. On the surface, the notion that an independent school accepts public money has to operate by public rules doesn't seem like what is unreasonable about that, I guess. If you're getting the overwhelming amount of your budget from public taxpayer funds, shouldn't there be some requirement that we follow the same rules that other public schools have to follow?
So every year at town meeting, the towns that, the school districts that send students to Burton and these other schools, every year these towns are voting to adopt and agree to pay the tuition that Burton is charging these districts. So, there's a common myth out there that somehow, the school districts are getting a bill and they have, no say over it, and that's just not true. Every one of our, sending towns is making a conscious decision every town meeting to continue to invest in their children's education by agreeing to pay the tuition that Burton is charging. So I think it's, this whole notion is really, simply a red herring.
The other thing is that independent schools have a very rigorous, like Burton and St. Johnsbury Academy and others go through a very rigorous independent school association examinations for how well we're doing and how good a school we are. And actually when we go through those processes, they're actually tougher than the state processes. So the schools, the independent schools, and especially the academies like Burton and St. Johnsbury, subject themselves to actually very rigorous examination.
So I'm a little puzzled then. If schools like Burton and Long Trail and other academies elsewhere in the state like Thetford or St. Johnsbury, was there any sense that none of these schools were somehow struggling or something? What prompted this initiative here on the part of the state board, as far as you can tell, to overhaul these rules?
It's really hard to say because, to be honest, there hasn't been a lot of public input into this process yet. So there was, the genesis of this is there was a resolution that was introduced last November at the State Board of Education meeting that basically asked the Agency of Education to update the independent school approval rules. The Agency of Education, took that mandate. They went back and over the course of many months, began work on this, but it was all behind closed doors. And then what happened on July 29th was the proposed rules, which had never been out in the public domain, were put in front of the State Board of Education at that meeting. And in a space of 10 minutes, I actually watched the video again last night, actually in less than 10 minutes, they went from a presentation of the draft rules to a unanimous vote to move the rulemaking process forward. There was actually almost no discussion or questions asked about these rules before they were put out into the public domain to start the public comment period. So I think, from a process perspective, it's really very troubling that they're would advance this so quickly without at least taking the time to think about the implications of these rules, which are very significant.
I think Oliver's point that he made at the very beginning is really the key point, that independent schools are different creatures. They're set up differently, they operate differently, they think differently. They have the ability to be entrepreneurial. So if you really want to, one way to think about what's going on is that the State Board of Education, rather than look at the independent school model under which 90 towns in Vermont operate, and look at some of the things they're doing really well and some of the opportunities that system creates, and say, let's look at how we can make some of those opportunities available to other schools. They're saying, let's make everybody exactly the same. Take away that entrepreneurial opportunities that comes with independence, and just make everybody one size fits all. If you happen to live in the town where that school is, you have to go to that town. You have to go to that school. That's really sort of sad. Rather than look at the opportunity and the model created by these independent schools and say we want to make them be just like every other school in the country, essentially, that's a really sad way to look at education. Rather than look at this as a model and something to which we could aspire and maybe pull parts from one into the other, they're doing exactly the opposite, and they're going to a one-size-fits-all model. That's what they're trying to do. And by the way, this would close half the independent schools in Vermont, because when you say that they have to carry every aspect of special education, for instance. These schools some of the schools, they just can't do it. And so what the State Board is really trying to do, this really is, if the rules are currently promulgated, this is war on independent schools, and it's really war on school choice. And it's really, it's not to be taken lightly, because if they were to go forward as promulgated, that's what would happen.
And one of the real concerns I have with this is that it is such a massive change in public policy. I've never seen something this big go through a rulemaking process. And we need to remember, and you know, we're getting in a little bit of the weeds here, but rules are sort of a process by which state government gets into the details of a policy issue. You know, we set state law within the legislature, and then we leave it to boards and agencies to work out some of the details. You know, for example, you know, we might pass a law that establishes a moose hunting season, and then the wildlife board basically decides how many permits they're going to issue. They're not making a major change to our hunting and fishing laws. The rules, and we've had legal analysis already done. I've asked our legislative counsel to look at this, and there are very serious questions about whether there's an abuse of the State Board of Education's authority here that we need to get through. And many legislators have, you know, I'm not alone, have expressed serious concerns about what they're trying to do. Similar attempts have been put forward in the legislature. There's a group of legislators from up in Chittenden County that have repeatedly introduced a bill that would prohibit the funding of independent schools. That bill has gone nowhere so far. We've had a lot of similar discussions. There was actually an attempt as part of the initial version of Act 46. There was a provision that would eliminate some elements of school choice. I was successful in proposing an amendment to strip that out. The legislature has been very clear over many decades in establishing a clear framework that distinguishes between independent and public schools and allows communities like ours to make our own decisions about whether we want to operate a public school or offer school choice.
Well, the other point that comes to mind, and you mentioned Act 46 there, the timing seems kind of odd with Act 46 and the merger study committees, not only here but elsewhere around the state, sort of many of them finally beginning to move forward or getting close to making proposals to the Agency of Education to say, well, here's our plan. How does Act 46 intersect with this, if it does? I mean, is there any kind of overlap here going on? Or
that one.
is it just...
They are completely separate issues, and this has been the point I've raised on many occasions with the Secretary of Education. It's a point I raised in my letter to the State Board of Education. It is, and I don't use this word lightly, but it was irresponsible of the board to put these proposed rules out in the public domain at a time when many of us, myself included, have invested considerable effort to try to quell some of the bad information, quite frankly, some false information that Act 46 was going to eliminate school choice. We've finally gotten past that. We finally have, you know, we've got study committees that are moving forward. They're having really good discussions, and now the State Board of Education has basically dropped this bomb, which has, you know, created enormous confusion out there. And I'm very fearful that of the impact that this will have on the merger discussions that are ongoing right now.
Well, it certainly does throw a question mark into it, particularly with Manchester and Dorset and Arlington, Sunderland talking about coming up with some kind of a merger. Well, Seth, what should this go through as is? And I realize that there's miles to go, perhaps, before that is finally the case, if it ever turns out to be that. I mean, what would the administration of Byrne-Burton do? Would you attempt to bring legal action of some sort, or what would be your response?
Well, there's a couple parts to the answer to that. One is that there certainly at some point would be a legal challenge for the reasons that Oliver has talked about as to whether the board had the authority to promulgate these rules. So that would obviously come as a second level. Obviously the thing we want to do is just stop them now. You never want to have to rely on going to war in the court system to win. But the bigger issue, the question I think you were asking is, what would Byrne-Burton do? And that is, Byrne-Burton will not change. We're an independent school, and we will remain an independent school. And we're not going to accept the equation that the State Board is in some ways trying to push onto a school like Byrne-Burton of saying you have to decide whether you're going to comply or not. You have to comply. What we're saying is that's not the right equation. The right equation is that the State Board of Education is saying children cannot come to Burn-Burton. The kids, the towns, and the children of the towns that we've served for 180 years can no longer come to Burn-Burton. Because for us just to say we will become a public school is to roll over effectively, and to let the State Board of Education undermine 180 years of work to make Burn-Burton the school that it is. A model for the country. Burn-Burton is it's a fabulous school. It does a lot of things for every range of kids. We've got some of the best programs in the state for kids living in poverty. We're doing things that public schools sometimes can't do. And we are not going to let the State Board of Education say to us, you must change. That's not the equation. The equation is what the State Board is saying, kids can no longer come to Burn-Burton.
What they're asking you to change, just so I'm clear, is it seemed like special education was one area they were concerned about. Board certification of teachers.
You'd have to have
and administrators.
You'd have to have an elected. The board would have to dissolve. That would undermine everything, because donors give to the school because we've developed a climate and culture with the board, with the governance structure that we have. It's simply different, and that goes away. And so Burn-Burton would no longer be Burn-Burton. Burn-Burton would be a public school. And the point isn't to denigrate or say anything negative about public schools. The point is, going back to Oliver's original point, we are a different creature. Mm-hmm. And we are going to remain that creature. That's not going to change.
How would students from towns in the various sending districts that currently send kids to Burn-Burton, when you say they wouldn't be able to come to Burn-Burton anymore, what does that mean? I mean, someone from...
I have no idea. I mean, that's the bomb, as Oliver has said, that they've just dropped out of nowhere into this system that is working. The one thing, and Oliver and I have talked about this, but we haven't said it today, nobody's yet told us what the problem is. This has been, all of a sudden, this whole notion of independent schools that Vermont's had for the last 180 years has to be blown up and can no longer exist, and we have to all be just like the public schools. Well, that doesn't make any sense, and we've got 180 years of history, we should, what we obviously want the board to do is just withdraw these rules and leave things the way they are.
Do you think there's a chance of that happening? That basically they would say, oh, okay, well, we didn't think about that part of it and forget about it?
Well, I think given the very serious legal questions that have already come to the surface through my own research and the analysis that's been prepared by legislative counsel, I think that the State Board of Education is going to have a very tough road ahead of them. But we have to remain vigilant, and this is, this would be a very different discussion if this was a conversation going on within the Board of Education, where we could be part of that conversation. But the minute they went through that 10-minute cycle of taking a draft and moving the process forward, they basically have put these rules out in the public domain. And I go back to my earlier point that was, without really truly understanding the full impact, that was an irresponsible thing to do. And just to speak to the impact, there's the obvious education impact that Seth has spoken to, but there's also a massive financial and economic impact to our region. I actually calculated our region could stand to lose upwards of almost $200 million in a loss to our residential grand list. There's actually... This
is through real estate?
Through real estate, absolutely. There's actually academic research that has been published in an academic journal that looked specifically at Vermont and the impact that school choice has on property values. And what they found was that there is a premium on residential real estate in the range of 3 to 16%. So I actually, took those percentages, applied them to the grand list values within our region, and we stand to lose, upwards of just under $200 million in property value should these rules go into effect.
That's because folks moved here, the idea that they would have school choice, and they bought homes here, and that attraction would no longer be present, and therefore the real estate market would plateau or perhaps go downwards.
You know, another interesting point, you know, we actually, you know, the principal of the local public elementary school that serves Londonderry, Weston, Peru, Landgrove, Floodbrook, you know, the principal there has pointed out that, you know, our school system is actually bucking the statewide trend. We actually have growing enrollment. We have people, and I know many people personally who have moved to Vermont from out of state and specifically chosen to move to our area because of our great public and independent school system within this ecosystem, if you will, that allows for school choice. It's a very compelling value proposition for a young family that is mobile, as many increasingly are.
And that, you know, what Oliver's talking about manifested itself this year, has every year actually, but at Burton, where we had 120 kids graduate from our 8th grade sending towns. All but 11 of those came to Burton, which would be 109, and yet Burton has 140 some odd freshmen. And that's just freshmen. And those are families who moved here in order to access Burton in large measure. And we actually have kids in sophomore and junior years doing the same thing. So what Oliver's talking about isn't just theoretical. It's very, very real. And we are bucking the system because families are moving here. Our census is going up while others are going down. Why don't we look at that as a model and look at that statewide and say, why aren't we doing the same thing everywhere if it's working so well here, rather than try to squash it?
And I recently had a conversation with Lyman Orton, who's the proprietor of the Vermont Country Store, and you know, I think he couldn't have said it better when he said, you know, school choice and access to schools like Burton is the crown jewel of you know, amongst our economic assets. And you know, he cited, you know, Vermont Country Store when they are recruiting talent from out of state, access to our independent schools through school choice is one of the key selling points.
Well,
so
I guess
it's not just property values; it's economy. They
right.
they go together, but that's part of it too. Families moving here with their businesses and finding employees for Lyman and others. It's remarkably important.
So we're running just about out of time here, but last point that probably is worth sharing with our viewers is that there will be a chance for everyone to weigh in on all of this, I gather, since the State Board of Education is going to be holding a hearing or a meeting in Manchester on November 22nd, starting at 6 p.m. to talk about this. I mean, what will be taking place here? Will this be like a regular meeting of the board that we'll have a chance to listen to and then ask questions, or is it going to be a different kind of format?
So I would just stress that that is a proposed date for a public hearing, and there will be several public hearings. It's part of the formal process where they basically will accept public comment from anybody who has an interest in this issue, whether or not they have children in the system. I would just stress that that's a proposed date. I have a feeling that date may change.
Okay. Well, we'll stay tuned then to make sure. At the moment, it's scheduled to be held at the Manchester Elementary Middle School from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. November 22nd. But I guess we'll
yeah, and
we'll watch for that.
I suspect, I believe that the meeting actually does not meet the notice requirements required under the law. So I suspect that issue will be uncovered and the meeting will be rescheduled. So.
Because it's one of, I think, 4 hearings they're going to
Correct.
have or elsewhere
Well,
around
it
the
was
state?
3 until Oliver got them to do the
Yeah,
4th.
they initially were not planning to hold a meeting in Manchester. I was quite forceful in suggesting that it would be more than appropriate to hold a meeting on this subject in Manchester.
Yeah, well, since there are so many independent schools in our area, that would seem appropriate for sure. Well, okay. Well, I guess we'll all stay tuned and see how this goes forward. Certainly would be a rather sea change in the whole way things work, and particularly muddying the waters even further with Act 46 going, just beginning to kind of finally move on to a point where voters would begin to kind of weigh in themselves and hear proposals. All right, well, that'll have to do it for today. I want to thank you all for joining us. This has been the GNAT TV News Project In Depth. I'm Andrew McKeever. It's been my pleasure to have with us today Oliver Olsen and Seth Bongartz. Hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you the next time.